And welcome to Inside Olympia. At the end of the legislative session, there was a changing of the guard of sorts. Longtime House Republican Leader J.T. Wilcox announced he was stepping down, but remaining in the legislature. In his place, the caucus elected Drew Stokesbary, the longtime ranking Republican on the House Budget Committee, as the new GOP leader. In our second half, we'll ask Representative Wilcox to reflect on his time as leader and find out why he decided to step down now. Joining me first to talk about why he wanted this position and what he hopes to accomplish going forward is the new House Republican leader, Drew Stokesbary. Welcome to the program and congratulations.
Yeah, thank you, Austin. Good to be here.
So let's start with that. Why did you want this job? And I want to ask you that in the context of the fact that you are an attorney in private practice, you have a young family. This is a very high time commitment position, both in and out of session. Why did you want the job?
You know, great question, and one that I think all 40 members of my caucus asked me as well. I mean, you're right. I have a busy life outside of here. Three young kids between the ages of 2 and 9. A pretty busy private law practice. But you know, I looked at the direction the state was going, and it ultimately came down. My decision to run for leader was the same reason I decided to run for office the first time in 2014 and run for re-election this last time, which is, I think I've got something to offer the state, and in this case, offer our caucus. Not very pleased with a lot of the decisions coming out of Olympia. Think that I can do a good job trying to redirect a lot of the energy in Olympia towards, I think, better progress and trying to stop as many of the bad things as possible. So thought that I could help serve my state, my community, in this case, my caucus. So was willing to kind of put my name forward, and thankfully, the caucus chose me to be their next leader.
What was your pitch to them? What was the case you made for why they should elect you? What you hope and think you can accomplish, especially in the minority?
Well, it's sort of twofold. I think the first part is recognizing the political reality now, which is that we have 40 members in a body of 98, where it requires at least 50 votes to pass anything. So I think part of the pitch was, look, while we're in the minority, we need to work as hard as we can, do as much as we can to try to move the ball in our direction as much as possible. Certainly I can't do that on every issue, but there's going to be times when there's things that our caucus wants, that we realize there's enough Democrats that we can move something forward in that way. Sometimes you know the ball is going to go a certain direction, and maybe you can stop it, or maybe you can keep it from only going 1 yard that way instead of 10 yards that way. There's no silver bullet, but a lot of working along the margins to try to drive the best policy outcomes we can with only 40 members. It requires a lot of creative thinking, a lot of deep understanding of policy, a lot of leveraging different members and different stakeholders to try to work toward a shared goal. And then that sort of builds to the second part, which is, I think we do that enough in Olympia and show the voters and the public that, hey, no matter what you think of Republicans in Washington, D.C., no matter what goes on in Congress or in the White House, Washington State House Republicans are serious people, serious leaders who want to do what's best for the people of Washington. And we've got real solutions for people facing real problems. And sort of through our work in the minority, I think the goal is eventually to be able to have a majority.
Help us understand how you're a King County Republican. What kind of Republican do you think you are? And then also, how do you lead a diverse caucus of Republicans who are sort of represent the continuum of Republicans?
Yeah, I think I'm a pretty typical Republican. I voted for George W. Bush twice. I grew up right here in Olympia, actually, which has kind of made my career feel a little full circle. But pretty sure I was the only guy in my neighborhood that had George Bush signs, yard signs out in their house. Probably didn't make my neighbors very happy. So I think I've got a set of beliefs and principles that I feel like I've sort of always had and always held, and will continue to hold. So I think in terms of what kind of Republican I am, yes, I live in King County now. I sort of have the ignominious distinction of being the only member of my caucus of 40 who actually lives in King County still. When I first got elected, there were 4 or 5 of us, and now I'm the only one. But in terms of representing the caucus, you know, there was an article in Politico talking about the difference between former Speaker Nancy Pelosi and current Speaker Kevin McCarthy. And a really smart commentator on Twitter pointed out that he learned long ago that leaders in legislative situations are price takers. They're not price makers. And folks with an economics background sort of understand innately what that means. But you know, a price maker is somebody like Apple who gets to, you know, make this cutting edge technology, and they can decide what they want to charge for it, and people will just either pay it or not pay it. But nobody can come in and scoop up that business because Apple makes the only iPhone in town. Yeah. Price takers are folks like farmers and food processors. You know, if I don't want to buy your egg because it's too expensive, I'm going to go buy the next guy's egg. If your wheat's too expensive, there's plenty of other people that will sell me wheat. And so, you know, a lot of times legislative leaders, people think that we're price makers, where we get to set the agenda, but I think in reality, we're price takers, where we're just representing where the caucus is, and I think that's my job. But luckily, I've got the best caucus you could possibly imagine. I mean, if we didn't have a representative democracy, if we somehow had a you know, meritocracy form of government where people applied to be your state legislator, and there was somebody sifting through resumes of thousands of Washingtonians who wanted to be in the legislature, I'm not sure you could find 40 more qualified people than we have in the House Republican caucus. They are really serious, hardworking public servants who represent their districts well, came to Olympia because they want to make a difference and want to help their communities and help the people of Washington. So it's pretty easy to represent them because they've got great ideas. They've got a ton of energy. You know, and we don't necessarily all think exactly the same way on every issue imaginable, but collectively, it's a really good group that cares deeply about the people of Washington and the direction of this state. And it makes, you know, leading them, despite the occasional differences we have, relatively easy.
What is it like to be a Republican and now a Republican leader in a state like Washington that's a blue state? When you look at the electoral map, it's actually quite a red state, but in terms of winning statewide races, a few big counties sway the elections, so it's a blue state in that sense. But also to be doing this work at a time when the Republican Party nationally is the party of former President Donald Trump. How do you reconcile that?
Yeah, you know, I mean, I think you look at what's happened in other states, places that are much more blue than Washington, like Massachusetts, Maryland, Vermont, have elected Republican governors in recent years. You know, you look at states like Wisconsin or Colorado or Minnesota, their legislative chambers, you know, often swing back and forth. Even right here in Washington, when I got elected in 2014, Republicans had control of the state Senate and at one point 48 members in the state House out of 98. So, you know, even though we've not had a Republican governor since the day I was born, and that's not an exaggeration, John Spellman's last day in office was the day I was born.
Is that right?
But, you know, we have had periods of either divided legislative control or you know, very, very close margins. So the period we're at right now, you know, I think is a bit of an anomaly. It's happened periodically, but this is not the steady state. This is not how it always is. And so I think our job as Republicans is, again, as I said a second ago, you know, make sure we're reminding the people of Washington that Washington State House Republicans aren't always the exact same thing as every Republican in every other state or in Washington, D.C. You know, and again, we've got real solutions for people's real problems, and we're here to govern and improve the lives of Washingtonians, not just stand on a soapbox and ideologue.
So you're the former leader. J.T. Wilcox said about you that you are one of the most creative thinkers he knows. You represent a next generation of leader in this state, and he thinks it's important that there be a generational shift at this time. And he also said that you are very effective, and this is kind of where I want to go with this, is when you're in the minority, there are not a lot of levers you can pull. But he said one of the things you're very effective at doing is getting amendments to pass to Democratic bills. So I want to ask you a little bit about that strategy, how you've been effective at that, and how you might, leading your caucus, sort of work to amplify that or extend that sort of approach. Because that's an interesting one. I never thought to sort of score a legislator on that metric, but it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, well, first of all, that's very kind of Representative Wilcox, but again, like I said a second ago, there isn't like a silver bullet or sort of a magic incantation where if only you do this procedure or say this, you can sort of magically get your way with 40 votes. Yeah. Kind of requires a case-by-case examination. But, a couple examples are about 4 or 5 years ago, I helped get about an extra $10 million in the state budget to fund salmon hatcheries that produce the types of salmon that orca most like to eat. Turns out orca have pickier diets than even my 9 and 7 and 2-year-old, and they don't just eat only salmon, only certain kinds of salmon. And so, sort of looking at how we can solve this problem, first of all, realize it was a problem that isn't just a Republican problem. It's Democrats, Republicans, everybody cares about increasing salmon runs and preserving our orca population. And that's where the next step was, all right, what are some good ways we can do this? There's a lot of ideas out there. Some are more controversial than others, but one that I realized was less controversial than others was to increase hatchery production. So I worked with the Department of Fish and Wildlife to understand, how we could do this. It turns out it's quite complicated. You have to deal with Federal Endangered Species Act and National Oceanic Administration. And, so in the course of this conversation, realized that while DFW state-run hatcheries are sort of at their maximum capacity, there's a number of tribal hatcheries around the state that probably with a little amount of investment could increase their hatchery production. So I began to work with tribal leaders, tribal fisheries, and realized that we could send about $10 million more to these tribal hatcheries to just completely maximize production of the salmon species that orca like. And so, it's leveraging things like that, where if a Republican just stood up and said, hey, I'm from the minority, I can't deliver any votes, but I would like $10 million for this pet project of mine, I think the majority budget writers would say, well, thank you, but we have other good uses for this $10 million. But instead I worked closely with a few key members in their caucus, worked closely with tribal leaders, and sort of formed this ad hoc coalition to sort of put that pressure on to the point where I think there was no way that budget amendment would not have passed. Another one that I think I'm really proud of is the Working Families Tax Credit. It's a policy that existed in state law since about 2008. It occurred to me a couple of years ago that there probably weren't votes for broad-based tax relief, but giving some people some tax relief was probably better for Republicans than not giving anybody any tax relief. So began to go around the state talking about our need to fund the Working Families Tax Credit. And candidly, I don't think that made Democrats very comfortable to hear a Republican talking about how we should prioritize funding what they had been claiming for 10 years was a priority, but they'd never actually literally put their money where their mouth is. And the law said that the credit would be subject to appropriation, which would mean you'd sort of have to, in the budget, say we're spending this much money
you have to fund
on the tax credit, and just budgets had passed year after year without ever funding it. So there's a bill that came to the floor that would have tweaked the formula but still not provided funding, and so I put up an amendment that said that removed the part that made the law subject to funding, which was sort of de facto the same as automatically funding it. And I had a number of Democrats call me and beg me to pull the amendment down, but just double down on our caucus position, which is that if we're not going to talk about giving broad-based tax relief to everybody, we should at least give some tax relief to some people, and that's what this did. And we were going to hold a vote on this amendment. You could oppose it or you could support it, and thankfully they eventually agreed to support it. So, it's understanding, in any kind of negotiation, whether politics or business or anything else, you've got to figure out how you can get folks on the other side to say yes, and what counts as a win for them. And the ways to get the best deals are figure out ways you can let them win without you having to lose anything. And so, something like funding for orca recovery or salmon recovery or Working Families Tax Credit is a good example. We didn't really have to give anything up. We got to increase salmon runs, which our constituents who are, recreational fishermen love. With Working Families Tax Credit, we got to, give the only real tax relief that happened in the last 4 or 5 years to the people of Washington. Mm-hmm. And Republicans are the ones that are responsible for that.
So you've given us a great insight into sort of how to be effective, kind of a case study or a lesson here on how to be effective in the minority. Let me ask you, because I think that the Working Families Tax Credit is also such an interesting case study from the standpoint, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't believe Republicans supported it when it was first being enacted. And then, as you note, Democrats didn't fund it. And then years later, you all come around as Republicans and say, hey, this isn't a bad idea, let's fund it. Is there a lesson there? Are there some ideas? You know, part of where my brain goes with this is, are there some ideas that the majority party has brought forth that you guys are maybe reflexively opposing, that maybe you should be more reflective about before taking a position on? Or is there some other lesson to be learned from this? Because I do think it's a fascinating case study.
You know, I think that is a good lesson, a good case study, Austin. But I would posit that probably what is happening more frequently is Democrats in the majority reflexively opposing Republican ideas because we come from the minority. You know, if we oppose an idea that Democrats have, we can't really stop it per se. Right. You know, if it ends up dying, it's for some other reason. It's because our opposition was persuasive. It's because they didn't really think it was a good idea in the first place, or what have you. But I think the much more common phenomenon is in the other direction. When we have an idea, but with 40 members, we don't have the votes ourselves to pass it. We need their votes. But because it comes from Republicans, they've been reflexively opposed, and I think that happens a lot more often, and it's too bad. One of the things I dislike most about the legislature is, you would think if you sort of just studied the text of the Constitution and our statutes, and you know, thought only about how the legislature existed in the abstract, you would think that the kinds of bills that should carry the day are bills that could get 50 votes out of 98 members. So, you know, really what sort of the swing vote is that 50th person. So if you can get a coalition of 50 people, they should be able to pass whatever they want. Right. In practice, that's not how it works. You need a majority of the majority. And so you actually have situations like we have now where there's 58 Democratic members. They pretty much their caucus never brings something to the floor that doesn't have at least a majority of their voters and some of their members, and sometimes even more than that. So that means that at minimum, you don't need 50 people to support a bill. You need 30 Democrats to support a bill.
So let me just, I want to kind of come back with this idea. So at the end of the legislative session, the Blake fix, which had to do with rewriting the drug laws in this state, failed. Democrats brought it to the floor. They didn't get any of your votes. They might come back and say, well, look what happens when we don't have a majority of the majority. The Republicans take a lunch break and don't vote for the bill, and look at what and it doesn't pass.
Well, but then look what happened once they included us in the process. We talked for a long time about our ideas on nearly every point in that really extensive bill. Republicans argued behind the scenes for this or that provision or this or that change. In almost every case, Democrats agreed to what we were asking for. And then the bill that came to the floor not only got nearly every Republican, but it even got more Democrats. You saw a similar thing happen with the operating budgets, where in this past session, where the House budget passed on party line vote, both when it passed the House initially and when the conference version passed. The Senate, on the other hand, that budget was very bipartisan. Almost every senator in the Republican caucus voted for the Senate version of the bill, and many continued to vote for the conference version. Yeah. The biggest difference was who was involved. Democrats in the House didn't include Republicans. Democrats in the Senate did include Republicans. And so I think the lesson, if I were the majority, would be if you want to actually get things done and talk about bipartisan accomplishments, all it really takes is engaging Republicans. You know, we're not that scary, and we have plenty of good ideas too. No party has a monopoly on good ideas. Definitely not Democrats, but not Republicans either. And I think the more we can talk about these kinds of things, the more we're going to find places where we agree that we didn't realize we agreed, like the Working Families Tax Credit. The more we're going to have work that we can actually be proud of, like the Blake decision. And so I think that should be the big takeaway, is that no matter who's in charge, they should listen to folks in the minority party. Republicans in the House represent about 3 million people in Washington, and their perspective ought to be heard.
There is an opportunity with a new leader coming in to reset relationships. What is your relationship with the Speaker of the House, Lori Jenkins? What's your relationship with the governor? How do you see your ability to work with them?
You know, I've got good professional relationships with both. I worked a little bit more closely with Speaker Jenkins when I first got elected. My first term, I was on the Judiciary Committee, and she was chair of that committee. So we worked on a couple bills together before she became speaker, and then we worked, I think, well together during the Blake negotiations. That's really the only time I've worked with her as speaker. You know, the governor, I've really not been shy of my criticism. I think most of it has been pretty deserved. You know, the manner in which our state agencies have been run, I think, leaves a lot. A lot is lacking, let's say that. In particular, what's going on at Department of Social and Health Services. I do not understand why the governor seems unable to find competent managers and executives to run that agency. Just the other day, they got fined millions of dollars again. They've had facilities in my district shut down, facilities across the state shut down. It's not a lack of funding. The legislature has put up more and more funding year after year. It is a lack of leadership and a lack of management ability. So I've not been shy about those kinds of criticisms, but the one time I sort of interacted with him and his office on a professional basis in this new job was with the Blake decision, and you know, he played a role. He called us in a special session and told each of the caucus leaders that he thought there should be a bill, that we shouldn't let it get to June 30th without a bill. And you know, I'll continue to work with his office to, you know, advance our caucus's goals as much as we can.
What about John Braun, the Republican leader in the Senate?
You know, I really like and admire Senator Braun. We've got a very similar background. He was, you mentioned that I was the ranking member on the House Appropriations Committee. Senator Braun was the ranking Republican on the Senate Ways and Means Committee for a number of years before he became leader. And I think that's actually unusual. When I first was asked to become ranking member on House Appropriations Committee, I had a senior member tell me that he thought I would be good at it, but he said, you know, this means you can never be leader, right? And I said, well, first of all, I didn't think I wanted to be leader, but out of curiosity,
rule, yeah.
Why? And he said, well, you know, because the budget folks, you know, have to be the ones that tell people, no, there's not enough money for this thing you want. No, we can't.
You'll have no friends when this is all over.
And so, you know, he said nobody. Occasionally, you have people go from committee chair or ranking member on a committee to being caucus leader. It never happens with the budget folks. That might be conventional wisdom. That might be true in other states, but I think Senator Braun and I both proved that wrong. But I think my point is, I really like Senator Braun because I think we think about things the same way. We approach problems, you know, in a similar fashion, sort of quantitatively. So I had worked with him a lot in his previous role as ranking member on Ways and Means. I'm, you know, excited to work with him now in our roles as caucus leaders.
So less than a minute left. How will you define success, at least in the near term?
You know, I think in the near term, what sort of House Republican priorities can we get through the legislative process, and how much can we stand in the way of ideas that we don't think are good? There's plenty of ideas that we don't think are good, and we're going to have our alternative ideas. There's other ideas that we think are so bad that they don't merit an alternative. Mm-hmm. So I think it's kind of twofold. One, what of our priorities can we get accomplished in one way or another, and for the things that we want to stop, how much of those can we stop? I think that's what we'll be focused on for the next couple of sessions.
And just very briefly, long-term goals?
You know, I think long-term goals is to not have to measure success around the margins, to be the ones who set the agenda here in Olympia, and I think we can do that.
Okay. I was going to say state representative, but House Republican Leader Drew Stokesbary, thank you for coming in. Appreciate it. Good luck in this new role and position. We appreciate it very much.